my son said, "Dad, don't come to your grandson's birthday. My wife doesn't want you there." I just turned around and left. 3 hours later, he called me 15 times. Turns out, their car broke down on the way to the cabin, and they needed my help. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Harrison's weathered hands as he adjusted the tiny superhero cape on the wrapped gift box. Inside lay a vintage toy train set, the same one he'd dreamed of giving his own son 37 years ago, when money was tight and dreams were all they could afford. Now, at 62, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines mapping stories around his eyes, Harrison finally had the means to give a grandchild everything he'd once wished he could provide. The phone call had shattered his peaceful morning like glass hitting concrete. Kieran's voice, once warm with childhood laughter, now carried the cold precision of a stranger delivering unwelcome news. "Dad, don't come to Logan's birthday party today. Serena doesn't want you there." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, acrid and suffocating. Harrison had stood frozen in his modest kitchen, the gift box suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Chen next door hanging laundry, her movements rhythmic and peaceful, a sharp contrast to the chaos now churning in his chest. The silence stretched between father and son like a chasm that had been widening for months, maybe years, without either of them noticing how deep it had become. "I see," Harrison had whispered, though he didn't see at all. He couldn't understand how his relationship with his daughter-in-law had deteriorated to this point. Couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when his presence had become unwelcome rather than cherished. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was being erased from his grandson's life, one birthday at a time. Kieran's breathing was audible through the phone, heavy and uncomfortable, as if he too was struggling with the weight of his words. It's complicated, Dad. Maybe next time." But they both knew there might not be a next time, not if this pattern continued. The unspoken truth settled between them like sediment in still water. Without another word, Harrison had set the phone down with the gentle precision of someone handling something precious and broken. He'd wrapped the gift with such care that morning, his fingers remembering the ritual from countless birthdays past. First Kieran's, now Logan's. The paper was covered in bright rockets and planets, because at 4 years old, Logan dreamed of being an astronaut, just like his grandfather had once dreamed of being a pilot, before life redirected his path toward more practical pursuits. The house felt different now, emptier somehow, as if Kieran's rejection had sucked some essential warmth from the walls. Harrison's wife Margaret had been gone for 3 years, claimed by cancer that fought harder than any enemy he'd faced in his 20 years of military service. Since then, his son and grandson had been his anchors, the lighthouse beacons guiding him through the fog of grief and loneliness. He'd turned around and left, just as Kieran had suggested, but not toward his grandson's party. Instead, Harrison found himself driving the familiar streets of their small town, past the diner where he'd taken Kieran for pancakes every Saturday morning after Margaret's diagnosis, past the park where Logan had taken his first wobbly steps just 8 months ago, past the library where 3 generations of his family had discovered the magic of stories. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had served his country with distinction, who had coached Little League for 15 years after his discharge, who had never missed a school play or soccer game when Kieran was growing up, was now considered too problematic for a 4-year-old's birthday party. The thought tasted bitter, like medicine that was supposed to heal but only seemed to make everything worse. Harrison pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Park, the same place where he'd taught Kieran to ride a bike. where they'd had countless heart-to-heart conversations during those turbulent teenage years. The autumn trees stood like silent witnesses to decades of family memories, their leaves now golden and red, preparing for the inevitable fall that would strip them bare before winter's arrival. Sitting on the bench where he'd once comforted Kieran after his first heartbreak, Harrison tried to piece together the puzzle of his fractured relationship with Serena. She'd seemed to like him well enough when she first started dating Kieran 7 years ago. He remembered her laughter at family dinners, the way she'd asked his advice about job interviews and apartment hunting. When had that warmth transformed into the icy politeness that now characterized their interactions? Perhaps it had started when Logan was born. Harrison had been overjoyed to become a grandfather, maybe too overjoyed. He'd visited the hospital every day, brought flowers and meals, offered to help with midnight feedings. Had his enthusiasm been mistaken for interference? Had his desire to be present been interpreted as intrusion? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, picking at his confidence until doubt became the dominant emotion. The afternoon sun climbed higher, and Harrison watched families arrive at the park, parents pushing strollers, children running toward playground equipment with the unbridled joy that comes before life teaches you to measure your steps. Each family scene felt like a mirror reflecting what he was missing, what he'd been excluded from. Somewhere across town, his grandson was blowing out candles, opening presents, creating memories that wouldn't include his grandfather's face. His phone buzzed once, then fell silent. Harrison didn't check it immediately, afraid it might be another message from Kieran, perhaps explaining in more detail why his presence was unwanted, or worse, saying nothing at all. The device sat heavy in his pocket like a stone, its weight disproportionate to its size, carrying as it did the possibility of connection or further rejection. The park began to empty as families headed home for dinner, leaving Harrison alone with the lengthening shadows and his growing sense of isolation. He'd built a life around service, first to his country, then to his community, always to his family. The idea that his good intentions had somehow been twisted into something harmful was almost impossible for him to process. How do you apologize for loving too much? How do you find the right distance when your heart keeps pulling you closer? As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Harrison finally stood to leave. The gift for Logan sat beside him on the bench, still perfectly wrapped, still full of hope despite the circumstances. He'd take it home, add it to the growing collection of presents he'd bought but never given. Birthday gifts, Christmas presents, little surprises that marked the passage of time and the widening gap between intention and reality. The drive home felt longer than usual. Each familiar landmark a reminder of the life he'd built in this town, the roots that ran deep despite the branches that seemed to be withering. His house stood dark against the evening sky, windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. Margaret had always said that a house without laughter was just a building, and tonight Harrison understood exactly what she'd meant. He'd barely stepped through his front door when the phone began to ring. Once, twice, then immediately again. The sound cut through the silence like an alarm, urgent and insistent. Harrison's heart began to race, his mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. In his experience, repeated calls usually meant emergency, crisis, something that couldn't wait for conventional communication. The caller ID showed Kieran's name, and Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the phone. Had something happened at the party? Was Logan hurt? Had his rejection of his father somehow brought bad luck down on the family? Superstitious thoughts, he knew, but grief and worry made fertile ground for irrational fears to take root and flourish. But instead of answering, Harrison hesitated. The same voice that had told him he wasn't welcome now seemed to be desperately seeking his attention. The irony was sharp enough to cut. Pushed away when convenient, pulled back when needed. The phone continued its urgent symphony, each ring a question mark hanging in the air between father and son. Harrison knew that whatever had prompted this flurry of calls, his response would set the tone for whatever came next. He could answer and potentially walk back into a situation that had already wounded him once today. Or he could let it ring and maintain the distance that Kieran had requested. Both choices carried weight. Both carried consequences that would ripple through their relationship for months or years to come. The gift sat on his kitchen table where he'd placed it, still wrapped, still hopeful, still representing all the love he'd wanted to share, but had been told was unwelcome. Outside, the night deepened, and somewhere in the darkness, his son was calling him 15 times. Each unanswered ring a bridge that might be built or burned, depending on what Harrison chose to do next. As Harrison stood in his quiet kitchen, surrounded by the echoes of unanswered calls and the weight of unspoken words, he realized that this moment, this choice between responding and withdrawing, would define not just the evening, but potentially the entire future of his relationship with his son and grandson. The phone had fallen silent now, but the questions it raised continued to reverberate through the house like distant thunder, promising a storm that was yet to come. The silence that followed the last ring felt heavier than sound, filled with possibilities both terrible and hopeful. Harrison's reflection in the dark window looked older than his 62 years, worn down by the day's emotional toll. But his eyes still held the same determination that had carried him through 2 decades of military service and 3 years of widowhood. Whatever crisis had prompted Kieran's desperate attempts to reach him, Harrison would have to decide whether love meant rushing to help or respecting the boundaries that had been so clearly drawn just hours before. 3 hours had passed since that morning's painful conversation. 3 hours that felt like 3 years in their emotional intensity. Now, with night settling over the town like a blanket, Harrison faced the most important decision he'd made since Margaret's funeral. Whether to bridge the gap his son had created or to honor the distance he'd been asked to maintain, even if it meant leaving Kieran to face whatever emergency had prompted those 15 frantic calls entirely alone. The weight of fatherhood had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, standing between the wrapped gift that represented hope and the silent phone that represented crisis. Harrison closed his eyes and tried to hear Margaret's voice, tried to imagine what wisdom she might offer in this impossible situation. But all he heard was the ticking of the clock on the wall, marking time that was slipping away, while he wrestled with a choice that seemed to have no right answer. When Harrison finally picked up his phone to check the missed calls, his hands were steady despite the storm raging in his heart. 15 calls from Kieran, each timestamp a minute or two apart, painting a picture of increasing desperation. No voicemails, just the raw urgency of someone who needed help and had nowhere else to turn. The man who had told his father not to come to his son's birthday party had been calling that same father 15 times in quick succession. And Harrison knew that whatever had happened, it was serious enough to make Kieran swallow his pride and reach across the chasm he'd created that morning. The irony was so sharp, it was almost comedic. In the span of a single day, Harrison had gone from unwanted guest to desperately needed rescue. But there was no satisfaction in being right about the unpredictability of life. No comfort in knowing that pride and stubbornness were luxuries that disappeared the moment real crisis struck. There was only the familiar weight of responsibility, the call to action that had defined so much of his adult life, and the knowledge that whatever had happened to bring Kieran to this point of desperation, his response would echo through their relationship for years to come. As Harrison prepared to return his son's call, he caught sight of his reflection in the kitchen window again. The man looking back at him had been a soldier, a husband, a father, a grandfather. Roles that had taught him that love wasn't always convenient, that duty didn't pause for hurt feelings, and that sometimes the greatest act of strength was showing up for someone even when they'd pushed you away. The gift on the table caught the overhead light, its bright wrapping paper a reminder that some things, like love, like family, like the bond between father and son, were worth fighting for even when the battle seemed impossible to win. The phone felt different in his hands now. No longer a source of pain, but a potential bridge back to the family he'd been shut out of just hours before. Whatever crisis waited on the other end of that call, Harrison knew he would face it the same way he'd faced every challenge in his 62 years. With courage, with love, and with the unshakable belief that family was worth every sacrifice, every swallowed word of pride, every moment of putting someone else's needs before his own wounded heart. The night stretched ahead of them, full of unknown challenges and unexpected turns. But for the first time since that morning's painful conversation, Harrison felt something other than rejection and confusion. He felt needed, and in that need, he found the first glimmer of hope that maybe this crisis, whatever it was, might become the bridge that brought them back together instead of the final wedge that drove them permanently apart. As he scrolled through the missed calls one more time, Harrison whispered a prayer to Margaret, asking for the wisdom to handle whatever came next with grace and the strength to love his son even when loving him hurt. Then, with the decisive action that had served him well throughout his life, he pressed the callback button and waited for Kieran to answer. Ready to face whatever emergency had transformed his rejecting son into a desperate caller who needed his father more than pride would allow him to admit. The phone rang once before Kieran's voice exploded through the speaker, raw with panic and relief. "Dad, thank God you're calling back. We're stranded, and I don't know what to do." The words tumbled out like water through a broken dam, all the careful control from that morning's conversation completely abandoned in the face of genuine crisis. Harrison felt his own heart rate increase, his mind automatically shifting into problem-solving mode, even as part of him registered the bitter irony of the situation. "Where are you, son? What happened?" His voice was calm, steady, the tone he'd used to reassure countless soldiers under fire, the same voice that had comforted Kieran through childhood nightmares and teenage heartbreaks. "We're about 40 miles out on Highway 9, heading toward the cabin for Logan's party." Kieran's voice cracked slightly. "The car just died. Serena is freaking out, Logan is crying, and it's getting dark. The cell service is terrible out here. I've been trying to call for an hour." The desperation in his son's voice cut through any residual hurt Harrison might have been carrying from the morning's rejection. Highway 9 was notorious for its lack of cell towers and roadside assistance, a winding rural route that connected their town to the mountain cabin where Kieran's in-laws owned property. Harrison had driven it countless times, knew every dangerous curve and blind spot, understood why his son would be panicked about being stranded there after dark with a small child and a woman who, despite her apparent dislike of Harrison, was still the mother of his grandchild. "Is anyone hurt?" Harrison asked, already reaching for his keys, his mind automatically cataloging what he'd need for a roadside rescue. Jumper cables, flashlight, emergency kit, warm blankets. The military had trained him to think systematically in crisis situations, and those skills had served him well in civilian life. "No, we're all okay physically," Kieran replied, his voice steadying slightly at his father's calm response. "But Dad, I know this morning I told you." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would force him to acknowledge the cruel irony of the situation. "Don't worry about this morning right now," Harrison interrupted gently. "Just tell me exactly where you are. Can you see any mile markers or landmarks?" As he spoke, he was already moving toward his truck. Grabbing his emergency kit from the hall closet, his movements efficient despite the emotional turmoil churning beneath his calm exterior. The conversation continued as Harrison prepared for the rescue mission. Each detail Kieran provided adding to his understanding of the situation. The car had made strange noises for the last few miles before finally giving up completely. They had some water and snacks, but no real supplies for an extended roadside wait. Logan was confused and scared, asking why the car wouldn't go and when they could continue to his party. Serena was quiet, which Kieran noted was unusual for her. Typically, she was the one to take charge in stressful situations. As Harrison listened to his son's voice, he couldn't help but notice how young Kieran sounded, how the confident adult who had delivered that morning's painful rejection had been replaced by someone who needed his father desperately. It was a reminder that no matter how old children get, no matter how far they push their parents away, there are moments when only a parent's help will do. When pride becomes a luxury that crisis simply doesn't allow. "I'm getting in the truck now," Harrison announced, settling into the driver's seat and starting the engine. "It'll take me about an hour to get to you, maybe a little less. Keep your hazard lights on, stay in the car, and don't let Logan wander off. Do you have a flashlight?" His voice carried the authority of someone who had handled countless emergency situations, and he could hear Kieran's breathing slow slightly in response to his father's confident take-charge attitude. "We have the flashlight app on our phones, but the batteries are getting low," Kieran replied. "Dad, I can't thank you enough for this. After what I said this morning, I know I have no right to ask for your help. But I didn't know who else to call. AAA says it could be 3 hours before they can get someone out there, and with Logan—" "You're my son," Harrison interrupted firmly. "That doesn't change because of one difficult conversation. Family helps family, period." The words came easily, carrying the weight of conviction that had been tested by the morning's events, but not broken. "I'll be there as soon as I can." As Harrison pulled out of his driveway and headed toward Highway 9, his mind was already working through the logistics of the rescue. Depending on what was wrong with Kieran's car, they might need to arrange for a tow truck, which could take even longer to reach such a remote location. They might need to transport everyone back to town in his truck, leaving the disabled vehicle for morning recovery. Logan would be hungry and tired, probably confused about why his birthday party had taken such an unexpected turn. The drive gave Harrison time to process the dramatic shift the day had taken. This morning, he'd been the unwanted father-in-law, the problematic presence who needed to be excluded from family celebrations. Now he was the rescuer, the competent problem solver rushing to help the very people who had rejected him just hours earlier. The situation would have been laughable if it weren't so emotionally complex. If it didn't highlight the fundamental contradictions in how his family viewed his role in their lives. But as he navigated the increasingly rural roads toward his stranded family, Harrison realized that this crisis might be exactly what they all needed. Sometimes it took an emergency to strip away the petty grievances and artificial boundaries that accumulated in relationships over time. Sometimes it took being genuinely vulnerable and in need of help to remember what really mattered, what was worth fighting for, and what was just pride dressed up as principle. The miles passed steadily under his truck's tires, each one bringing him closer to his son and grandson. Closer to a chance to be the kind of father and grandfather he'd always wanted to be. The gift he'd wrapped so carefully that morning was still sitting on his kitchen table. But Harrison suspected that showing up tonight, being the reliable presence his family could count on when everything else fell apart, might be worth more than any present he could ever buy. As the darkness deepened around him, Harrison allowed himself to hope that this rescue mission might mark the beginning of a new chapter in his relationship with Kieran's family. not because Serena would suddenly welcome him with open arms. That kind of fundamental change rarely happened overnight. But because sometimes shared adversity created bonds that were stronger than the forces trying to pull people apart. Tonight, he wasn't the rejected father-in-law. He was simply a man driving through the night to help his family. And that felt like a role he could inhabit with pride and purpose. The headlights of his truck cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating the road that led to his son, his grandson, and whatever opportunity this crisis might create for healing the wounds that morning's conversation had opened. Harrison pressed slightly harder on the accelerator, eager to reach them, eager to prove that love didn't stop flowing just because someone built walls to block it, eager to show that family was stronger than pride, more enduring than temporary conflicts, and always worth the effort it took to preserve it through both smooth roads and unexpected breakdowns along the way. When Harrison finally spotted the hazard lights blinking in the distance, his heart rate increased with a mixture of relief and anticipation. The sight of his son's disabled car on the shoulder of the dark highway was both the destination he'd been driving toward and the beginning of whatever would happen next between them. As he pulled his truck behind the stranded vehicle and put on his own emergency flashers, Harrison took a deep breath and prepared to step into whatever role this crisis required him to play. Father, grandfather, rescuer, or simply the man who showed up when showing up was what mattered most. The moment Harrison stepped out of his truck, Logan's voice cut through the night air like a beacon of pure joy. "Grandpa, Grandpa's here." The 4-year-old's excitement was infectious. His small face pressed against the back window of the disabled car, hands waving frantically. In that instant, all the morning's pain seemed to evaporate, replaced by the simple, uncomplicated love of a grandchild who didn't understand adult complications and saw only the grandfather who had come to help. Kieran emerged from the driver's seat, his relief visible even in the dim light cast by the truck's headlights. The confident man who had delivered that morning's rejection was gone, replaced by someone who looked younger, more vulnerable, genuinely grateful for rescue. "Dad, I can't believe you came so quickly," he said, his voice thick with emotion he was clearly struggling to control. "Of course I came," Harrison replied simply, already moving toward his emergency kit. "Let me take a look at what we're dealing with here." His tone was matter-of-fact, professional, designed to communicate competence and calm in a situation that clearly had everyone on edge. This was familiar territory for him, being the problem solver, the steady presence that others could rely on when things went wrong. Serena climbed out of the passenger seat more slowly, her usual composure clearly shaken by the ordeal. She looked pale in the artificial light, her dark hair disheveled, her typically perfect appearance showing the strain of several hours stranded on a dark highway with a confused 4-year-old. When her eyes met Harrison's, there was something different in them. Not warmth exactly, but not the cold politeness he'd grown accustomed to either. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, her voice carrying a genuine gratitude that Harrison hadn't heard from her in months. "I know today was complicated." It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, and in the context of their current situation, it felt like progress. Harrison nodded and moved to examine the car, lifting the hood and shining his flashlight into the engine compartment. Years of maintaining military vehicles had given him diagnostic skills that served him well in civilian emergencies. The engine bay told its story in the language of mechanical failure, a serpentine belt that had snapped and taken several other components with it when it failed. "Well, the good news is it's not the engine," he announced, wiping his hands on a rag from his emergency kit. "The bad news is you're not driving this tonight. We'll need to get it towed to a shop in the morning." He watched as the implications of this news settled over the small family group. No continuing to the cabin tonight. No birthday party is planned. No avoiding the reality that they needed Harrison's help to get home safely. Logan had managed to escape from the car during the automotive diagnosis and was now tugging on his grandfather's jacket with the persistent enthusiasm that only small children could maintain in stressful situations. "Grandpa, is the car sick? Can you make it better?" His questions were delivered in the matter-of-fact tone children used when they believed adults could fix anything, solve any problem, make any scary situation normal again. "The car needs to go to the doctor, just like people do sometimes," Harrison explained, kneeling down to Logan's eye level. "But don't worry. We're going to get everyone home safe and sound." The little boy nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with this explanation, then brightened considerably. "Does this mean we can have my birthday party at your house instead?" Logan asked with the adaptability that made children such remarkable creatures. "You have the big backyard with the swing, and Mom packed my birthday cake in the cooler." His suggestion hung in the air like a challenge, forcing all the adults to confront the awkwardness of the situation they found themselves in. Kieran and Serena exchanged a look that Harrison couldn't quite interpret. Some silent communication passing between them that spoke to the complexity of their current predicament. They needed Harrison's help to get home, but accepting that help meant acknowledging that the morning's rejection had been premature, perhaps unfair. They were dependent on the man they'd pushed away, and that dependency created an opportunity for grace that could either heal relationships or make them more awkward than before. "That's a wonderful idea, buddy," Harrison said carefully, not wanting to pressure anyone but also not wanting to disappoint his grandson. "But we should ask your mom and dad what they think about that plan." He looked up at Kieran and Serena, his expression carefully neutral, leaving the decision entirely in their hands, while making it clear that Logan's suggestion was welcome, as far as he was concerned. The silence stretched for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was, filled with the weight of morning's harsh words and the evening's desperate phone calls. Then Serena surprised everyone, most of all herself, by speaking first. "Actually, that sounds perfect," she said quietly. "If Harrison doesn't mind the last-minute invasion, it might be better than trying to reschedule everything." Kieran's relief was visible, as if he'd been holding his breath, waiting to see how this moment would resolve itself. "Are you sure, Dad? I know this isn't what any of us planned for today." His voice carried an apology that went beyond the immediate inconvenience, touching on the larger wounds that the day had opened between them. "I can't think of anything I'd rather do tonight than help my grandson celebrate his 4th birthday," Harrison replied, and the honesty in his voice seemed to surprise all of them. The house has been too quiet lately anyway. A little birthday party chaos is exactly what it needs. He stood up, brushing dirt from his knees, already mentally rearranging his evening around cake and candles instead of solitude and regret. The logistics of the rescue operation took on a different energy once they'd settled the question of what would happen next. Harrison's truck was large enough to accommodate everyone, though it would be a tight fit with the birthday supplies, overnight bags, and accumulated detritus of a family road trip. Logan was thrilled by the prospect of riding in Grandpa's big truck, climbing into the back seat with the enthusiasm of someone embarking on a grand adventure, rather than being rescued from a mechanical breakdown. As they transferred belongings from the disabled car to Harrison's truck, the conversation gradually became more natural, less strained. Logan chattered about his birthday wishes, describing in elaborate detail the superhero-themed party he'd been imagining. Serena found herself laughing at her son's dramatic gestures, and even Kieran seemed to relax as the immediate crisis transformed into something more manageable, more normal. "You know," Serena said as they loaded the birthday cake cooler into the truck bed, "Logan talks about your house all the time. He loves that big oak tree in the backyard." keeps asking when we can visit again." It wasn't quite an admission that she'd been the obstacle to those visits, but it was close enough to acknowledge that barriers existed and might not need to be as high as they'd become. Harrison felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for months without fully realizing its weight. "He's welcome any time," he replied simply. "Both of you are. All of you are." The words carried the hope that tonight might mark a turning point. The crisis had created an opportunity for understanding that normal circumstances had somehow made impossible. The drive back to town took on an unexpected festive quality, with Logan leading everyone in increasingly silly car games and birthday songs. Kieran found himself remembering family road trips from his own childhood, the way his father had always been able to turn potential disasters into adventures, problems into opportunities for family bonding. It was a skill he was just beginning to appreciate as a parent himself. And watching his father effortlessly take charge of their current situation reminded him of qualities he'd somehow forgotten to value in recent years. By the time they pulled into Harrison's driveway, the evening had taken on a surreal quality that none of them could have predicted that morning. The house that Logan had been banned from visiting 12 hours earlier was now going to host his 4th birthday party. And the grandfather, who had been deemed unwelcome, was now the hero who had rescued them from a roadside emergency and saved the celebration. Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he unlocked his front door, not from nervousness, but from the emotional whiplash of the day's events. This morning, he'd left this house carrying a carefully wrapped gift, nursing a broken heart. Now he was returning as the host of an impromptu birthday party, with his son and daughter-in-law looking at him with something approaching gratitude, and his grandson bouncing with excitement about the unexpected change in venue. The house seemed to come alive as they entered, lights switching on to reveal rooms that had been empty for too long. Spaces that had been designed for family gatherings but had been hosting only one lonely occupant for months. Logan immediately claimed the living room as his territory, spinning in circles with his arms outstretched, marveling at the high ceilings and family photos that covered the mantelpiece. "Look, Mom, there's pictures of Dad when he was little." Logan's discovery sparked a tour of the photo gallery, with Harrison providing commentary on decades of family memories captured in frames. There was baby Kieran in his grandfather's arms, toddler Kieran learning to walk in this very living room, school-age Kieran proudly displaying soccer trophies and academic awards. The visual history of their family relationship seemed to provide context for current tensions, reminding everyone of the love and shared experiences that connected them despite recent difficulties. Serena found herself genuinely engaged with the photos, asking questions about Kieran's childhood that her husband had never shared in detail. Harrison was a natural storyteller, painting pictures of Little League games and camping trips, first days of school and Christmas mornings. The man emerging from these stories was not the interfering father-in-law she'd constructed in her mind, but someone who had been deeply invested in his son's happiness and success, someone whose current desire to be involved with Logan came from a place of genuine love rather than manipulation or control. Dad was always there for everything, Kieran found himself saying as they looked at a photo from his high school graduation. "Every game, every school event, every time I needed help with anything." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as anyone else, as if he was rediscovering truths about his father that recent tensions had temporarily obscured. Logan, meanwhile, had discovered the wrapped gift that Harrison had left on the kitchen table that morning. The bright rocket ship paper immediately caught his attention, and he approached it with the reverent excitement that 4-year-olds reserved for presents that might contain their deepest wishes. "Is this for me?" he asked, his voice full of hope and wonder. "It is indeed," Harrison confirmed, lifting his grandson up so he could examine the package more closely. I wrapped it this morning for your party. I'm glad we still get to have a celebration, even if it's not quite the one anyone planned. The weight of the morning's rejection seemed very far away now, replaced by the immediate joy of a child who believed in the magic of birthday surprises. As Logan carefully untied the ribbon with the concentration that children brought to important tasks, the adults found themselves holding their breath in anticipation. The paper fell away to reveal the vintage train set, complete with tracks and tiny buildings, the same set Harrison had dreamed of giving a grandchild for years. Logan's gasp of delight was worth every moment of uncertainty the day had contained. "It's perfect," he announced, immediately beginning to examine each car and building with the intense focus that new toys inspired in young children. "Can we set it up right now? Can we make it go around the whole living room?" His enthusiasm was infectious, drawing smiles from all the adults who had spent the day navigating much more complicated emotional terrain. The next hour passed in a blur of activity as they transformed Harrison's living room into a birthday party venue. The dining room table became the center of operations, covered with Logan's favorite superhero tablecloth that Serena had packed for the cabin celebration. The birthday cake, miraculously undamaged by the evening's adventures, took center stage, its 4 candles waiting for their moment of glory. Harrison found himself working alongside Serena to arrange party decorations, their conversation gradually becoming more natural as they focused on creating magic for Logan. She was, he realized, much more relaxed when she wasn't trying to maintain careful boundaries, when she could simply be a mother working with another adult to make her child happy. The woman who had seemed so cold and dismissive in recent months revealed herself to be thoughtful, funny, genuinely devoted to Logan's happiness in ways that Harrison could understand and appreciate. "You know," she said as they hung streamers from the ceiling fan, "Logan has been asking about you constantly. Every time we drive past this street, he wants to know when we can visit Grandpa again. I didn't realize how much he missed coming here." The admission felt like an apology, though she didn't frame it as one directly. "He's always welcome," Harrison replied gently. "I know I can be enthusiastic sometimes, maybe too enthusiastic. If I've overstepped boundaries, I want you to know it was never intentional. I just love being a grandfather more than I ever imagined I would." His honesty seemed to surprise her, as if she'd expected defensiveness rather than genuine self-reflection. Kieran, meanwhile, was setting up the train set with Logan, both of them completely absorbed in the engineering challenge of making the tracks fit around furniture and through doorways. Watching them work together, Harrison was struck by how naturally his son had stepped into the role of father, how patiently he explained things to Logan, how easily he balanced fun with gentle guidance. It reminded him of countless similar scenes from Kieran's own childhood, moments when problems became projects and frustration transformed into collaboration. "Dad, I need to apologize for this morning," Kieran said suddenly, not looking up from the train tracks, but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "What I said was unfair, and the way I said it was wrong. You didn't deserve that, and Logan didn't deserve to be kept away from you." The words came in a rush, as if he'd been building up to them all evening but hadn't found the right moment until now. Harrison paused in his streamer hanging, feeling the weight of the apology and the courage it had taken for his son to deliver it publicly. "We all say things we don't mean when we're stressed," he replied carefully. "What matters is that we're here together now, making Logan's birthday special. That's what family does. We show up for each other, especially when things get complicated." "But it wasn't just stress," Kieran continued, finally looking up to meet his father's eyes. "I've been letting small irritations turn into big resentments, and that's not fair to anyone. You've been nothing but supportive since Logan was born, and I've been treating you like you're the problem instead of appreciating all the help you've offered." His honesty was clearly difficult, but seemed necessary, as if the evening's events had forced him to confront truths he'd been avoiding. Logan, oblivious to the emotional undercurrents of the adults' conversation, chose that moment to announce that the train tracks were ready for their inaugural journey. The timing was perfect, providing a natural transition from serious conversation to birthday celebration, from apologies to joy. As they gathered around to watch the little train make its first circuit of the living room, all the tensions and misunderstandings of recent months seemed to fade into background noise. The train chugged along its winding path, carrying with it the hopes and renewed connections of a family that had almost lost its way, but had found its center again in the simple act of celebrating a 4-year-old's birthday. As Logan clapped his hands in delight and the adults found themselves laughing at his pure joy, Harrison realized that sometimes the best gifts came wrapped in crisis. That sometimes the most meaningful celebrations were the ones that almost didn't happen at all. When it came time to light the birthday candles, they gathered around the kitchen table with Logan standing on a chair so he could properly oversee the ceremony. The 4 small flames flickered in the warm light of Harrison's kitchen, illuminating faces that had traveled from conflict to crisis to celebration in the span of a single, extraordinary day. As they sang Happy Birthday together, their voices blending in the familiar melody, it felt like they were singing their way back to being a family that could weather any storm, solve any problem, and find joy even in the most unexpected circumstances. Logan took the candle-blowing responsibility very seriously, closing his eyes tight and making a wish that he immediately announced involved trains, superheroes, and everyone being happy always. Then he opened his eyes, took a deep breath, and blew out all 4 candles in one impressive effort, earning cheers and applause from his audience of 3 adults who had learned more about love, forgiveness, and family in one evening than they had in months of careful politeness and accumulated grievances. As they cut the cake and settled into the comfortable chaos of a successful birthday party, Harrison caught Serena's eye across the table. She smiled at him. Not the polite, distant expression he'd grown accustomed to, but a genuine smile that acknowledged shared experience, mutual understanding, and the possibility of a relationship built on more than just tolerance. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a beginning. And beginnings were often more valuable than perfect endings. The evening stretched ahead of them, full of cake and laughter, train adventures and family stories, the comfortable noise of people who had remembered how to enjoy each other's company. Outside, Kieran's car sat disabled on a dark highway. But inside Harrison's house, something much more important had been repaired. The delicate machinery of family connection that had been running rough for months, but was now purring along smoothly, powered by forgiveness, lubricated by love, and guided by the simple understanding that some things were worth fixing no matter how much effort it took. As Logan played with his new train set, his laughter filling the house with a sound that had been missing for too long, Harrison looked around at his family gathered in his living room and felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the resolution of the day's crisis, but for the reminder that love was stronger than pride, that family connections could survive misunderstandings, and that sometimes the most beautiful celebrations were the ones that grew out of unexpected soil, nurtured by necessity and watered with tears of relief and joy. The night was still young, but already it had delivered more healing than months of careful conversations and cautious interactions had managed to achieve. Sometimes, Harrison reflected as he watched his grandson drive the toy train through elaborate figure-eights around the coffee table, the best way to fix what was broken was to stop trying so hard to avoid breaking it further, to let crisis do its work of stripping away everything that wasn't essential, leaving only what really mattered: love, family, and the willingness to show up for each other when showing up was what mattered most. As the celebration continued around him, Harrison felt Margaret's presence in the room, not as sadness, but as warmth, as if she was smiling at how her men had found their way back to each other. The house that had been too quiet for too long was full of life again, full of the voices and laughter that made it a home rather than just a building. Logan's 4th birthday party would go down in family history, not as the celebration that almost didn't happen, but as the night when they all remembered what it meant to be a family worth fighting for, worth forgiving, worth showing up for no matter what obstacles stood in the way. The gift Harrison had wrapped so carefully that morning had found its way to its intended recipient after all. But the real present of the evening was much more valuable than any toy train set. It was the gift of restored relationships, of second chances, of love that was strong enough to survive rejection and pride and all the small cruelties that families sometimes inflicted on each other when they forgot that home was supposed to be the safest place in the world, the place where forgiveness was always possible and love was always stronger than whatever had tried to damage it. 3 months later, Harrison stood in the same kitchen where he'd wrapped Logan's birthday gift. But this time, he was preparing for a different kind of celebration. Through the window, he could see Logan playing in the backyard with the train set, which had become a permanent fixture on the back porch, its tracks now expanded into an elaborate network that wound around planters and through carefully constructed tunnels made from cardboard boxes and paint. The morning sun painted everything in golden hues, just as it had on that memorable October day. But the atmosphere in the house was completely different now. Serena was due to arrive within the hour, not because of an emergency this time, but because Saturday mornings had become their regular time together. She'd started coming over to help Harrison with his vegetable garden, a project that had grown from a casual comment about fresh tomatoes into a shared passion that surprised them both. Kieran called from the living room, where he was assembling furniture for the nursery they were setting up in Harrison's guest bedroom. The announcement had come 6 weeks earlier. Logan was going to be a big brother, and they'd decided that having a full nursery at Grandpa's house would make family visits easier and more comfortable for everyone. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them. The house that had once been declared off-limits was now becoming a second home for their growing family. "Dad, can you bring the screwdriver with the magnetic tip?" Kieran called out, his voice carrying none of the tension that had characterized their interactions for so many months before Logan's birthday crisis. The relationship between father and son had evolved into something stronger than it had been before their troubles began, tempered by their shared experience of almost losing something precious and their mutual commitment to never let pride create such distance between them again. Harrison found the requested tool and carried it to the living room, where baby furniture was scattered across the floor in various stages of assembly. "How's it going in here?" he asked, settling down beside his son to help with the more complex construction tasks that required multiple hands and patience. "Better now that you're here," Kieran replied, and the simple statement carried weight beyond its literal meaning. They'd established a new pattern in their relationship, one that acknowledged Harrison's skills and experience, while respecting Kieran's role as the primary decision-maker for his own family. It was a delicate balance, but one they'd learned to navigate with grace and good humor. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by Logan's excited voice shouting, "Mom's here! Mom's here!" Through the back door, Harrison and Kieran exchanged amused glances. Their 4-year-old had become the unofficial director of all family gatherings, taking his role as social coordinator very seriously. His enthusiasm for bringing all his favorite adults together in one place had been instrumental in healing the rifts that had once seemed insurmountable. Serena entered through the kitchen, carrying a bag of fresh produce from the farmer's market and wearing the wide-brimmed hat she'd adopted for their gardening sessions. The transformation in her relationship with Harrison had been gradual but profound. What had started as grudging appreciation for his help during their roadside emergency had evolved into genuine friendship based on shared interests and mutual respect for each other's devotion to Logan's happiness. "The tomatoes are already getting huge," she announced, settling the market bag on the counter. "I think your composting technique is working better than any store-bought fertilizer." She'd become genuinely enthusiastic about organic gardening, surprising herself with how much she enjoyed working with soil and seeds, planning seasonal plantings, and harvesting the fruits of their shared labor. "Wait until you see what Logan's been working on," Harrison replied, leading her toward the back door. "He's been designing what he calls a train garden, tracks that go around the vegetable beds so his trains can help with the gardening. Yesterday he spent an hour loading tiny freight cars with cherry tomatoes." The image of his grandson integrating his two favorite activities, trains and helping with garden work, never failed to make Harrison smile. As they stepped onto the back porch, Logan came running toward them with a boundless energy that seemed to be his permanent default setting. "Grandma Serena!" Logan shouted, launching himself into her arms with the confidence of a child who knew he would be caught and welcomed. The nickname had emerged naturally during one of their gardening sessions, when Logan had decided that since Harrison was Grandpa, Serena needed a special title too. She'd been so moved by the designation that she'd had to turn away to hide her tears, overwhelmed by the unexpected gift of being claimed so completely by this small person who saw only love where adults had once seen complications. "What have you been building today, my little engineer?" Serena asked, settling Logan on her hip and surveying the elaborate track system that now dominated the back porch and extended into strategic locations throughout the yard. What had started as a simple birthday gift had evolved into a complex transportation network that reflected Logan's growing understanding of how things connected, how individual pieces could be joined together to create something larger and more wonderful than the sum of their parts. "I made a bridge over the pepper plants so the trains don't hurt them," Logan explained with the serious pride of someone who had solved an important engineering problem. "And I put a station by the herb garden so the trains can pick up basil for Mom's cooking." His integration of practical concerns with imaginative play demonstrated a mind that naturally looked for ways to make different parts of his world work together harmoniously. As they walked through the garden together, examining Logan's latest innovations and checking on the progress of their various plantings, Harrison felt a profound sense of contentment that had nothing to do with accomplishment and everything to do with connection. The vegetable beds they'd planned and planted together represented more than just fresh food for family meals. They were a metaphor for the patience required to nurture relationships, the faith needed to plant seeds without knowing exactly what would grow, and the joy that came from tending something carefully over time and watching it flourish. "I've been thinking," Serena said as they knelt together to harvest lettuce for lunch, "that maybe we should start a family cookbook. Logan could illustrate it, and we could include recipes that use ingredients from our garden." The suggestion reflected how naturally she'd begun thinking in terms of we and our when it came to family projects. How seamlessly she'd integrated Harrison into her vision of what family life could look like when everyone focused on contribution rather than control. "That's a wonderful idea," Harrison replied, already imagining Logan's artistic interpretations of vegetables and cooking processes. "We could include some of Margaret's recipes too. She had amazing techniques for preserving and canning that would work perfectly with garden produce." The mention of his late wife came easily now. No longer a source of pain that had to be carefully managed, but a natural part of conversations about family traditions and shared knowledge. Kieran appeared in the garden doorway, wiping his hands on a rag and looking satisfied with his furniture assembly progress. "The crib is ready for its first inspection," he announced. "Logan, want to come check out where your little brother or sister is going to sleep when they visit Grandpa?" The question prompted another burst of excitement from Logan, who took his big brother responsibilities very seriously and had been intimately involved in every aspect of preparation for the new baby. As they trooped inside to admire the completed nursery, Harrison marveled at how naturally his house had transformed back into a family gathering place. The rooms that had echoed with loneliness for so many months now rang with laughter and conversation, filled with the comfortable chaos that came when multiple generations shared space and common purposes. The nursery itself was a testament to their collective commitment to making sure this new baby would grow up knowing they belonged to a large, loving family that had learned the value of staying connected through both smooth times and storms. "It's perfect," Serena declared, running her hand along the crib rail that Kieran had sanded and Harrison had painted a soft yellow that would work for a baby of either gender. "This little one is going to be so lucky, having a big brother who loves them already, and grandparents who are so excited to be part of their life from the very beginning." Her words carried gratitude that went beyond the immediate moment, acknowledging the gift of healing that had emerged from their October crisis. Logan was already making plans for how he would teach the baby about trains and gardening, constructing elaborate scenarios in which he served as guide and protector for this new family member. His enthusiasm for the expanded family constellation reflected the security he felt in relationships that had been tested and proven strong. Connections that had survived misunderstanding and emerged more resilient than before. As they prepared lunch together in Harrison's kitchen, using vegetables from their garden and recipes that blended traditions from multiple family sources, the conversation flowed with the ease of people who had learned to value each other's perspectives and contributions. Serena described her latest ideas for companion planting. Kieran shared stories from his work week that had everyone laughing, and Logan provided running commentary on everything from the optimal way to wash lettuce to his theories about what the new baby would want to learn first. The meal they shared felt like a celebration, though it marked no particular occasion beyond the simple fact of being together on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. As Harrison looked around his dining room table at the faces of his family, his son, his daughter-in-law who had become a true daughter of his heart, and his grandson who bridged every gap with the pure magic of unconditional love, he understood that this was what happiness looked like when it grew up, when it matured beyond the fleeting excitement of momentary pleasures into something deeper and more sustainable. After lunch, as they settled on the back porch to watch Logan demonstrate his latest train route innovations, Serena surprised everyone by pulling out a small wrapped package. "I know it's not anyone's birthday," she said with a slightly shy smile, "but I saw this at the market and thought Harrison might like it." The gesture was small but significant. The first gift she had chosen for him independently, a symbol of how their relationship had evolved beyond mere tolerance into genuine affection. Harrison unwrapped the package to reveal a beautifully crafted wooden sign that read, "All aboard the Family Express," with small painted trains decorating the borders. It was clearly meant for Logan's train setup, but the message spoke to something larger about their journey together, about how they'd all learned to climb aboard the sometimes unpredictable locomotive of family life, and trust that love would keep them on track even when the route took unexpected turns. "It's perfect," Harrison said, and meant it in ways that went far beyond the gift itself. "Logan, where do you think we should put this?" As his grandson considered the various possibilities for displaying their new sign, Harrison caught Kieran's eye and saw his own gratitude reflected there. They'd come so far from that painful October morning, when rejection had seemed like the final word on their family story. The afternoon drifted by in the kind of peaceful contentment that could only be fully appreciated by people who had experienced its absence. Logan continued his elaborate train demonstrations, occasionally recruiting adults to serve as passengers or freight loaders in his increasingly complex transportation scenarios. The conversations moved easily between practical matters: garden planning, baby preparations, work schedules, and the kind of silly exchanges that emerged when people felt completely comfortable with each other. As the sun began to set and the evening air took on the gentle coolness that marked the transition from day to night, they began the reluctant process of preparing to separate. Logan's protests about leaving were half-hearted. He knew now that family time wasn't rationed or scarce, that next Saturday would bring another gathering, that his grandfather's house would always be a place where he was wanted and welcomed. "Same time next week?" Serena asked as she gathered her gardening tools and market bag. And the question carried the weight of tradition being established, of patterns being set that would endure beyond any single gathering. Harrison nodded, already looking forward to their next shared morning in the garden, their next meal prepared together, their next afternoon of watching Logan orchestrate elaborate adventures with his ever-expanding train empire. As Kieran loaded Logan into the car and Serena made sure all the garden tools were properly stored, Harrison felt the familiar tug of goodbye mixed with the comfort of knowing that this wasn't really an ending, but just a pause in an ongoing story. The relationships that had been broken and repaired were now stronger for having survived their test, more precious for having been temporarily lost and then found again. "Dad," Kieran said, pausing at the driver's side door of his car. "Thank you for everything, not just today, but for showing us what it means to be family, even when we make it hard." The words were simple, but carried the weight of lessons learned through difficulty, wisdom earned through the willingness to keep showing up even when showing up hurt. "That's what love does," Harrison replied, echoing words Margaret had said to him countless times during their marriage, during the challenging years of raising Kieran, during her illness when love meant accepting help and letting go. "It shows up, especially when it's hard, especially when it matters most." The truth of this statement had been tested and proven in their own family story, demonstrated in actions that spoke louder than any promises or declarations. As their car pulled out of the driveway and Harrison waved goodbye from his front porch, he felt the deep satisfaction that came from a day well spent, relationships well tended, love well expressed through both words and actions. The house behind him was quiet now, but not empty. It held the echoes of laughter and conversation, the lingering warmth of family connection, and the promise of next Saturday's gathering already taking shape in his imagination. Logan's gift box from that memorable October birthday sat on the mantelpiece now, repurposed as a holder for family photos that documented their journey from crisis to healing to joy. The sight of it never failed to remind Harrison that sometimes the most valuable presents came wrapped in problems, that sometimes the greatest gifts emerged from circumstances that initially seemed like disasters, that sometimes love had to be tested before it could be fully trusted. The story that had begun with rejection and emergency had evolved into something beautiful and sustainable. A narrative of forgiveness and second chances that would shape not just Harrison's relationship with his current family, but the legacy he would leave for the grandchild who was yet to be born. Logan's little brother or sister would grow up knowing Grandpa's house as a place of safety and celebration, would learn about family loyalty through stories of how love had survived misunderstanding and grown stronger through adversity. As Harrison turned off the porch light and headed inside to prepare for another week of anticipating Saturday's gathering, he carried with him the profound peace that came from knowing that some things, the most important things, really could be fixed when people cared enough to do the work of mending them. The train tracks in his backyard would weather many seasons. Logan would grow into new interests and responsibilities. The new baby would bring fresh dynamics to their family constellation. But the foundation they'd built together, the commitment to showing up for each other, the willingness to forgive and be forgiven, the understanding that love was both strong enough to survive crisis and gentle enough to nurture daily happiness, would endure through all the changes yet to come. The house settled into its nighttime quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of a space that knew it would soon be filled with voices and laughter again. A home that had learned the rhythm of family life and was content to rest between gatherings, knowing that the best stories were not those with perfect beginnings, but those with endings that made all the middle difficulties worthwhile. Harrison's story with his family was far from over. It was just beginning its next chapter, and every page promised to be better than the last.